Gary Stearman sitting in for J.R. Church, another Prophecy in the News update, and we have as a special guest William J. Federer, author, lecturer, historian. He's written the book Endangered Speeches. Welcome once again to Prophecy in the News, Bill.
Gary, great to be with you.
Well, we're going to go right to this book on page 35, and I want Bill to wax eloquent on one particular idea that's very pertinent today. We're going to talk about something that started in the days of FDR.
Well, FDR said this in 1934. He said, "A few timid people who fear progress will try to give you new and strange names for what we are doing. Sometimes they call it fascism, sometimes communism, sometimes socialism."
Wow.
They're trying to make very complex and theoretical something that is really very practical. The real truth of the matter is that for a number of years in our country, the machinery of democracy had failed to function. Now, you got to get the picture. Here's FDR saying, hey, democracy is just not functioning. We're going to do something new. It's called communism. Here's what Ronald Reagan said. One commonly held view during the Roosevelt era was that all societies were moving towards some modified form of communism. Well, who was a disciple of FDR? None other than Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. And so Lyndon Johnson said this, "My administration will not be deterred by those who say to risk change is to risk communism."
Wow.
And so we see this idea of, now what is communism? Philosophically, it goes all the way back to Plato. 380 years before Christ in Greece, they attempted a democracy and it was a bunch of chaos. And Plato said, well, you know, we need to have a philosopher king, enlightened despot, a benevolent monarch, somebody that has all the power, but they're really a good guy, right? And what this guy will do is he'll collect all the children from all around the countryside and indoctrinate them, and then we'll have this great society. This is what Plato talked about. Well, this idea of a centralized power and was adopted by, obviously, the monarchs, but also Karl Marx. Karl Marx said, let's have a centralized power with these really smart guys, and they can make all the decisions and take the kids and indoctrinate them in the public schools. And so communism took over all these countries. And so here's FDR talking about this. And his staff was filled full of what later were revealed to be communists. When the Berlin Wall went down, a whole lot of the KGB records were made public, and sure enough, there were people in his administration. One was Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss, who worked for Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice. Albert Hiss was there at Yalta, on the boat where they had the treaty to give away Eastern Europe to the communists. Alger Hiss wrote the charter for the United Nations that had the communists be on the Security Council. So they knew everything. That's why we didn't win Vietnam and Korea, because we had communists who knew everything we were doing. Alger Hiss was revealed by Whittaker Chambers, who was a defected spy, that he had communist intentions.
So what you're saying is that these progressives advocated change. Now, when they say change, they mean something more than change from a representative republic. They want to change to almost a different system entirely, right?
Right, and so when we look at what's going on today with our government and the Boston Tea Party's 9/12, people are all upset. Why? Because they're realizing that the government has quietly been enacting these goals where the government's taking over everything. And I began to explain how we went from the concentrated powers of the monarch during our revolution, where the king was the king of the country, the commander of their military, and the head of their church. I mean, the government controlled what the churches were supposed to believe. Imagine that. And then we went to the sort of like hate crime legislation, fairness doctrine, where they were going to tell you what you could believe and talk about. We went from that to the separated powers of our Constitution. Separated into three branches, separated federal and state level, and then we tied up the federal government with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. But after every crisis, we see a gradual reconcentration. So, for example, it was great that Lincoln ended slavery, but in the process, he concentrated power in the federal government, took rights away from the states. It was great that Woodrow Wilson got us out of World War I, but in the process, he concentrated power in the federal government with the Federal Reserve Act and income tax. Franklin Roosevelt got us through the Great Depression and World War II, but he concentrated power in the federal government with his New Deal. Lyndon Johnson concentrated power with the Great Society, and then Bush even concentrated power with his war on terror, but now the new president's concentrating power, taking over banks, car companies, and wanting to take over the healthcare where we have life and death power over everybody in the country.
Wow. Now, we think of LBJ and the Great Society, and you've got a chapter in here entitled LBJ Lives On. In what way do you mean this? LBJ lives on.
LBJ wanted the government to control what the 501c3s could do and what could not do. Today, in the chapter I have in there, is where the federal government, Senator Grassley, wanted to investigate 6 television ministries because they were 501c3s, and he wanted to make sure they were spending their donations right.
Oh.
And so this is the same thing that LBJ. But now the question is, the ACLU is a 501c3 organization. Is the federal government going to